Good evening. I just want to welcome you all to Writers Speak. Tonight we have Maya shanbhag, and we're really excited to have her back on campus. It's been a couple of years. We have one of our MFA students, Jillian Castoro, is going to come up and introduce Maya. So Jillian, come on up.
I am so happy to introduce our incredible guest, Maya shanbhag. Maya is an author, essayist, and teacher. Her memoir, What We Carry, was named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and Best of 2020 by Amazon, Good Morning America, and the Times of India, among others. Her novel, The 16th of June, was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize. Maya's essays and short stories have been published by New York Magazine and the Kenyon Review, among many more, and she is the winner of the Neil Shepard Prize in Fiction. She was named a Woman You Should Know by the American Civil Rights Museum for her work representing Indian American voices in literature. She earned her MA at NYU and her Ph.D. here at Stony Brook University, and we are so happy to have her back here tonight. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Maya.
Thank you, Jillian, and thank you, Christian. Side note that you guys nailed the shanbhag. You were 2 for 2, and that never happens, so props to you for that. And thank you to all of you for having me here and to being here. Before I begin, I wanted to mention the Q&A part is always the thing I look forward to and enjoy the most. So I really hope that any things that you have been wanting to ask, thinking about, that have been like nagging at your thoughts, whether on the subject of craft or the writing process or publishing, I'm here for it. And my goal is for our time together to be useful to all of you. So What We Carry sometimes gets described as a caregiving memoir, because I was tending to my mother during her dementia. She's still alive, while also caring for my young child. And I suppose that description is true, yet it has never felt right to me, because I think this book for me was really about the dawning realization that this parent I had revered and idolized was someone I did not know at all. There was a kind of myth-making always at play between us, which is to say, on some level, a deceit. Voltaire said that illusion is the first of all pleasures. We tell stories in order to live, says Joan Didion. And so I really think that this is a story about blind spots, and in particular, the role of stories in our lives. So with that, I'll begin, and I will be reading, rather than several kind of continuous pages, I'll be reading little excerpts that move around in time. My mom and I talk often, sometimes daily. She's my first phone call, the one who makes any piece of news real, any achievement official, any blow less painful. The mere act of greeting each other can cause us both to laugh. Hi, Mom, I sing the words. My joy at getting her on the line is palpable, like an addict getting hold of a drug. Having spent most of her career as a psychiatrist, she has an exquisite way of listening. She asks about each part of my day, no detail too small. If I tell her I need to go grocery shopping, she wants to know the name of the market, how far it is, if I like it there, so I'm left with the pleasant sense that she is with me. Hi, Mom. The 2 syllables open a magic door, sympathy and understanding on the other side. I love when she picks up. I don't bother hiding it. When she picks up, I am home. She reacts to me the same way. If it's been a few days since we last spoke, she bursts out, Mayudi Shanudi Ranudi. It is a nonsense rhyme in Marathi. Little Maya, my sweetheart, my queen. The 3 words lining up like cherries on a slot machine. My mom and I laugh gaily, basking in our shared affection. She knows what she means to me. I know that she knows. It pleases us both, mom and daughter, in need of nothing and no one else. When I was 4 years old, my mom took me to the dentist. We had just moved to Long Island from Queens. The dentist was white and handsome, a novelty. Accustomed to Indian faces and speaking Marathi, I grew shy in his presence. As he examined my teeth with gloved hands, he tried to engage my mom in conversation. "Are you folks from India?" he asked. "You speak Hindi?" He pronounced Hindi the American way, which I'd never heard before, causing me to giggle. He frowned and reached up to adjust the light. "New gloves," my mom barked. "Excuse me? You have broken sterile technique by touching the light. You must change your gloves." He blinked, then smiled. "Listen, miss, I've been in practice for decades. Did you disinfect that light after your last patient? This is a young child. You must change your gloves. And I am not miss, I am a doctor." Reddening, he slowly removed the gloves and reached for new ones. Not 10 minutes later, she corrected him once more. New gloves. Something transpired that day. I left the dentist's office with my head held high. 6 months later, when we returned for my checkup, the dentist looked cowed. "Dr. Shanbhag," he said, I disinfected the light." My mother did not change for others. She caused others to change for her. In her fierceness, I felt her love. She was my advocate. She did not care what people thought of her. She cared about what mattered, me. When I was a kid, my mom would often discuss her patients with me. Maybe she did so because they were on her mind, or maybe she knew how much I loved hearing the stories. I couldn't believe people's problems. The inability to leave the house without touching the sidewalk 7 times, the voice of God in a light bulb. It was like being let in on a secret. Grown-ups struggled. Her patients came to her after their medications failed. They came to her after being told they were imagining the side effects. They came to her when they were at their wits' end. She came home furious about their mistreatment, hastily scribbled scripts, unnecessarily high dosages, the mountain of problems resulting from a simple misdiagnosis. These enraged her. She had little patience for other psychiatrists who didn't understand the newest medications, and she had tremendous sympathy for her patients' plights. She sided with them, always. This pleased me. I liked thinking of her as a champion of the underdog because it meant there was hope for me as the underdog of the family. Home life revolved around my brother and my dad. 8 years older than me, my brother had very important tests to study for. I was to be quiet and stay out of his way. My father asserted himself as the patriarch. My mom earned more money than him and was the true head of household, but this was never to be acknowledged. She cooked his meals and ironed his shirts and washed his socks, a swirl of black in the basement sink. My dad had a temper. I became his main target after my brother left for college when I was 10. "Worthless girl," he would mutter. He told me that men are smarter than women. "That is why most inventions come from men," he would say. When I'd point out that women haven't been given as many opportunities, he'd retort, "What's the reason for that? Because they aren't as smart." Against this backdrop, my mom's stories provided a glimpse of an alternate universe where people weren't worthless. They were simply misunderstood. My dad would never sympathize with the need to touch the sidewalk 7 times, any more than he understood why I read novels. Garbage, he called them. To him, I was useless. To her, no one was a lost cause. Being out with her at the mall or supermarket was like being with a celebrity. People came running up to us. "Dr. Shanbhag," they cried. They would turn to me. "You don't understand. Your mother saved my life. Your mother is amazing." Their eyes were emphatic. "Do you get it?" they seemed to say. "Do you see how wonderful she is?" While patients thanked her profusely, my mom would chuckle. "It's just the medication," she would remark after the person walked away. Yet always, always, there was a story. The guitar player who turned manic when placed on the wrong antidepressant, the severely dyslexic teenager misdiagnosed as schizophrenic, the single father of two committed to a psychiatric ward against his will, despite not posing a threat to himself or his children. To give them the right diagnosis, she had to listen. I knew she was being modest when she suggested otherwise. I knew from my own experience that she listened with exquisite care. My mother was born in Bombay in 1945. She was born Suhas Sankolkar and became Suhas Shanbhag when she wed, a Brahmin marrying a Brahmin. And though she identifies as a Democrat, she is fiercely proud of her noble caste heritage. She brags about the servants she had on hand throughout her childhood, there to squeeze fresh pomegranate juice for her or bring a hot lunch to school, running the whole way to keep it warm. She laughs whenever she recounts this, delighted, while my brother and I wince. She likes to boast about her grandfather, who stood over 6 feet tall and had fair skin and green eyes. "Mom, you shouldn't brag about light features," I object. "It makes you sound like some sort of Aryan pride nutjob." "Well," she says, "the word Aryan actually comes from Sanskrit. It is true." She says this possessively, as though wanting credit for the word. In Marathi, the word for good-looking, gori, is the same as the word for pale. My relatives praised me for how gori I was. "My grandfather's genes," my mom would say proudly. Physically, I bear no resemblance to her. She's recognizably Indian, while people always try to guess my heritage with those awful 3 words. "What are you?" "Italian?" they ask. Or wait, South American? I'm told over and over that I don't look Indian, which is a strange thing to hear. I don't look like what I am. We are a study in contrasts. Her hair is fine, mine is thick. She is petite and flat-chested. I am taller and curvier. As a girl, I coveted her features. All I wanted was to be of her, visibly and identifiably. Our differences became more apparent when I hit puberty at the unjustly early age of 9. It was like that moment when the Hulk tears through his shirt, an appalling burst of growth. I reached my full height at 5'6" in the 5th grade. I loomed over my mother. How I envied her body, the way her button-down blouses sat neatly against her chest, while mine gaped in alarm. The elegant compactness of her slim hands and feet, while mine flapped gargantuan by contrast. She was orderly, prim, no visible hair on her arms or legs, no need to pluck her perfectly arched brows. I never saw her double over with menstrual cramps, never even heard her pass gas. She was a hairless, efficient wonder. It made perfect sense that she was a scientist. She had no need for daydreams. Her body was reliable. Mine betrayed me at every turn. Her whole life felt mythic. She was born to an India still under British rule, which struck me as wildly romantic. Even her childhood dog, Ruby, had a thrilling tale. My mom spotted Ruby on a docked ship while accompanying her uncle, a naval inspector, on his rounds. The ship's captain, eager to please the inspector, offered the dog up as a gift. Ruby followed my mom home that day, trailing her through the winding streets of Bombay. "Didn't she whine?" I asked, "and didn't you need a leash?" "No," my mom said, "she just followed." All her stories bear this enchanted quality, dotted with British references. The house on Slater Road, the closest railway stop, Grant Road Station, the private school where she spoke Queen's English and wore a uniform, a white blouse and pleated skirt and patent leather Mary Janes that gave her bunions. Even this flaw struck me as elegant. I used to angle my big toe to try to mimic her tapered feet. So, you came to the States to give your kids opportunities? I asked. Yes, she said, but she wouldn't elaborate. She spoke of home wistfully, and it became a nostalgic place frozen in time, a butterfly, pinned and preserved. She refused to call her birthplace by its new name after it was rechristened Mumbai. It would always be Bombay to her. An indulged only child, she was given a birthday gift every month by her father. Once a year wasn't enough to celebrate her. She'd grown up with a menagerie of pets, doves, lovebirds, squirrels, and never had to lift a finger with so many servants. I had nagging questions. Were the servants miserable? Wasn't the caste system wrong? And what does one feed a squirrel? But my questions felt petty and intrusive. She didn't want questions. She wanted an audience. I was happy to provide it. It is a cruel feature of memory that trauma retains its vividness while love fades to a blur. I don't have too many recollections of my mom from early childhood, but the ones of my dad are clear. 7 years old, summer. He sends me to the driveway because he finds a crayon of mine under the couch. He orders me to stand barefoot on the blacktop. He will watch me from the living room to make sure I don't hop between feet or take refuge on the grass. The blacktop shimmers, nearly liquid under the July sun. I cry, my feet as hot as my shame. I tell myself to move, but I can't. A police car drives by, a rarity on our suburban street. I think about flagging the car down for help, but worry I'll get my family in trouble. Later, the shock of cool water, a yellow basin, my mother's hands at my blistered feet. She takes me to Friendly's for ice cream. I order the Reese's sundae. I don't like its sticky sweetness, but I do like her concern. Please eat, Mayodi, she says. Finishing the sundae will show her that I'm okay. I eat it dutifully, spoon by spoon. So the following takes place after my mom has been living with me for a few months, and because of her dementia, she has turned more candid and less mythic. As my mother and I drop our pretenses, I find that I can ask her anything. I voice all the nagging questions I had as a kid. Did Ruby really follow her home without a leash? Probably a servant carried her, she admits. What about giving birth? Did it really not hurt as she had always maintained? She chuckles. If I do not remember pain, probably I had an epidural. One day it occurs to me to ask the biggest question of all. Mom, I say slowly, how did you know you wanted to be a psychiatrist? I didn't, she answers right away. I wanted to be an OBGYN. She explains that she suffered from postural hypotension, meaning she couldn't stand for long periods without getting dizzy, a deal breaker for performing C-sections. With her dream job ruled out, she settled for psychiatry. That way I could sit in a chair, she says. For the next several days, I'm in a state of shock. A neighbor could confess to committing murder, and all I would think about was my mom's desire to be an obstetrician. Psychiatry did not appeal to me at all, she admits. So many problems. Listening to people can be very boring, you know. At least babies are a source of happiness. It is the last straw, the final puzzle piece, that makes me realize how much I've deluded myself where she is concerned. The crux of her identity was an accident, She became a psychiatrist out of a desire to be seated. She hadn't planned for me all along, and her trajectory in life wasn't a straight line. I wonder sometimes why I did not go back to India, she remarks one morning over tea. Staying in this country, it just happened. What a surprise it would have been to hear this as a girl, to know that my mother was someone to whom things happened, that this was permissible. She wanted to give me the illusion that she'd known what she was doing. I let her. But this is not to say that those illusions were meaningless. My mom's old stories may have been riddled with untruths, plagued by a suspicious lack of detail, but they defined her. They weren't necessarily true to events, but they were true to her. As a writer, I should have known better. I, of all people, should have understood that a story needn't be accurate in order to be true. Now that the illusions have been stripped away, I miss my mythic mother. I suspect she misses her too. I've been taking care of her physical needs, but who is she becoming under my care? She has lost her former stature. She is stronger, able to take the stairs without help, able to go on longer walks, but she lacks her old haughtiness. Maybe it doesn't matter whether our stories are true or false. What matters is that they are ours. Okay, and one last little bit. I find it difficult now to talk about my mom with others. Even at the linguistic level, I don't know what words to use. My mom was a psychiatrist, I might say. No, she's still alive, I quickly add, seeing the person's expression. But even that statement, she's still alive, feels misleading. The phrase quality of life exists in healthcare for precisely this reason, to assess whether daily life is meaningful. This is difficult to gauge with dementia because the organ making that determination is what's affected. If my mom spends 20 hours in bed, how alive is she? If she doesn't remember how she spent the morning, doesn't remember what I gave her for lunch, doesn't remember our conversation from 5 minutes ago, what state is she in? What is the present without the past? What kind of verb is that? I'm reminded of the grammatical verb tenses I learned while studying French. Past perfect, conditional. Maybe that describes it. The past was perfect. Everything now feels conditional. I want to assemble a new verb tense for dementia, conditional past perfect, because sometimes under the right conditions, my old mom shows herself. I get a tantalizing few minutes with former mom. Our reunion is always too brief. I feel my memory glorifying her, preserving her, making its tactful erasures. The past perfect in French is actually called the plus que parfait, which means more than perfect. And that might be the truest description of all. The buried past is beyond perfect. It gets to stay that way. Is, was, here, gone. Sometimes when I look at her, I feel she's not really there. I think she left long ago, and that might be the better question. Where are you, Mom? Perhaps she is back in India, an indulged girl in Bombay, watching her lovebirds and squirrels, Ruby following her from room to room, servants in the background, her father holding out a gift. Maybe that's where she is, in the buried past, the more than perfect. I am on the outside, tapping at the glass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. We're going to open up to questions.
Yay.
Thank you. I enjoyed those readings. I actually bookmarked the part where you said it was so poetic about remembering pain and love and how
Trauma and
how kind of unfair that is. But then I thought, I think it was a couple chapters afterward, it was so beautiful you wrote about being a parent and how it really like drove your inspiration and how it like fueled it. And I really enjoyed that part about thinking about sometimes children as a sacrifice and giving up your dreams, but then how just the way you wrote about it, like fueling your dreams because you're raising these people, so and you're raising yourselves. I thought that was really beautiful. So I don't know if you want to maybe just touch on that a little bit more, because I really enjoyed that whole kind of theme.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, and that means a lot. Yeah, one thing I will say is that, I always say, and I mean this very, very true, like genuinely, that it's not that I write despite being a mom, it's that I write because I am a mom. And I don't know if some of you guys can relate to this, but I feel like I spent a lot of my life terrified of pursuing writing. Absolutely terrified. And I was pre-med in college, which is so funny to me now. I took the LSAT. My first job out of college was working as a management consultant. I then got a PhD in Comp Lit. And even though that was kind of writing adjacent, it was sort of like if you're deeply closeted, like living next to a gay bar. In the sense that, like, I wasn't writing creative, but I could sort of be around fiction and yet have, like, a cloak of professionalism with my Indian family. And, yeah, and it wasn't until actually I became, I was pregnant that I was suddenly like, what am I doing? And I recognized that I'd been scared. I'd just been scared. It wasn't a matter of time or anything else. Those were just excuses. It was really that I was afraid of finally trying this thing that I'd always wanted to do. And it struck me, there's no way I can look my kid in the eye and say, you should go after your dreams if I haven't done that. And I thought, even if I totally fail and this goes nowhere, I want to be able to truthfully say, this was my thing that I always loved and always felt like my identity, and so I gave it a shot. And suddenly, even though I had less time than ever, less mental bandwidth than ever, less frequent showers as a new mom, even though all of that was true, and I was not my best self by any means, what I did have was a clearer motivation and a clearer focus and a sense that, like, oh yeah, this isn't some like bourgeois, indulgent, nonsense pursuit. This is about being who I am and not running from that, which is everything. So I was able to kind of take myself seriously at a time when you would think that's the last thing you can prioritize.
Thank you so much. One of the things that you read from your memoir really struck me anew when you read it this evening, and you said just because something doesn't have to be accurate for it to be true. Yeah. And it's one of the things we were talking about a little bit in our class right before this. And I'm wondering, as you look back, when you're writing memoir, how accurate do you try to be, or do you feel like you need to be, to individual events and things as compared with maybe just telling more of a universal truth from those things?
Such a good question. Thank you for the question. First of all, just so I know, are you guys all writing memoir, thinking about, or do you want to?
Oh, we're just talking about it in class.
Yeah.
The class, we're just going sort of, so they're write everything.
Okay. So here's what I would say. I think it's really important, I think, during the first draft of anything, memoir, fiction, book-length manuscript, short story, poem, no matter what it is, I think it's really important to kind of have blinders on and just go. Because if you stop to ask those questions or investigate those questions, wait, did she retire when she was 63 or was it 60? You can lose that thing that's calling to you and that made you sit down. And so I think to mentally flag whatever questions come up or just kind of register them and say, okay, I'll deal with you later, is important, because you want to get to that sort of beacon that's, calling out to you. And I think this actually comes up in fiction too, strangely. When you're writing about a character, sometimes there's a little voice that pops up in your head that goes, wait, would that character do this? Is this like a weird thing? And I think it's good to just go with it, because later you can come back. So for example, when I wrote the first draft of this, there were several things that I got factually wrong, little things. And I did stuff like went back through email, looked at my journals, talked to my brother, called up people, because I did want to get things factually correct. And those were pretty easy to fix. But I think had I been sidetracked, it would have derailed me, and I wouldn't have been able to capture certain emotions or certain things that, that's the good stuff, is the thing that, the question that's driving you, the feeling that you're trying to articulate precisely, and the rest is kind of noise. I think it's important with memoir to remember we're not journalists when we're writing about our own lives. That's reporting is different. What we're trying to capture is that truth or that lived experience. Yeah.
Hello. I guess I have a two-parter, and it's kind of a personal question.
Yeah.
So I guess the big elephant in the book is your father. And you had just said, I think based off of the first question, that you were afraid to pursue writing professionally. I'm wondering if your relationship with your father had a lot to do with that. And while writing this book, did you kind of have the opportunity, like, I'm just curious about the resolution with your father, if you could speak about that a little bit. Like, were you able to come to terms with him? Like, I don't know. Yeah. That's really personal. I apologize.
No. Oh my God, no. Well, the joke among memoirists is that we're open books. Sorry, had to. No, so I'll say a few things about that. It's funny because both of my parents somehow instilled in me the sense that writing was something I absolutely could not do. And they never said it. We never had some sit down about it, because that was just unthinkable. Even talking about it was unthinkable. But there were just these moments growing up. I remember when a cousin of mine, my aunt called my mom, and the aunt was crying hysterically. My mom sounded so concerned. And when my mom came up, I was like, what happened? What is it? She said, oh, Ritesh only got a 1250 on his SAT. And it was this genuine, you thought this kid was going to be homeless. So it's absurd, but growing up, you don't think to question these things. So I really truly thought that unless I became a doctor or an engineer, that life would not be okay. And so the closeted metaphor comes up for me with writing, because it was this feeling of if you're growing up in a Southern Baptist family or something, it's just there's the track that is set out for you, and you do not deviate from that track. And so that was ingrained in me in a deeply powerful way. And with my father in particular, he was I think offended when he would catch me reading or writing, and it was this whole thing of, I didn't come to this country for you to waste your time this way, that guilt and that sense of here's how you're supposed to be living your life. And in some ways, this relates back to storytelling. Like I, your father, have a narrative in my head for what your life is supposed to look like. And I don't want you writing your own story, literally or figuratively. So yeah, he and I are estranged. I haven't spoken to him in probably a little more than 15 years now. And when this book came out, before it came out, I had a call with the general counsel of Penguin Random House, like their legal team, because one of the things they were wondering, when you talk about someone particularly through the lens of abuse, they basically were asking me, like, do you think he might sue? And I remember having this moment where I thought, like, God, would he do that? I don't know. I have no idea. And I said, probably not. And yeah, he never reached out to me. My guess would be, to be honest, that he hasn't read it. Because I think on some level, narcissists only read things that concern them. Yeah, and I will also say, just in case it's sort of interest, my first draft of this book really didn't have, like that scene I read, the driveway scene, it didn't have that, and it had very few specifics about my father. I didn't want him in it. And my editor called me, and she said, you've described your father as scary and, occasionally violent, but it's all abstract, and I think we need a scene with him. And I wasn't yet on the other side of this book, right? So at the time, I knew my editor was right, but immediately I was filled with terror, just really deep fear. And every time I wanted to please my editor, every time I tried to write about him, my body would get super uncomfortable to the point where I would break out into hives. So the body remembers, right? And like often when we try and take ourselves back, the body resists. And I kept trying and trying and trying. And one day I noticed that most of the hives seemed to be around my feet. And I thought, oh God, that's so weird. It's like my feet are trying to tell me something. And then that memory came back. And I didn't know that I possessed that memory. And the way that I wrote that scene, this is gonna sound so weird, but the way that I wrote that scene, I had to put a basin of water under my desk. It's very difficult to break out into hives if you're underwater. So it was like comforting to have the water there. And that kind of let my body know, you're okay. It's safe to write about this. So that's how I wrote that scene. And part of why I talk about this, I think when we're writing, sometimes it even happens in fiction, where we get scared, we get nervous. And I think it's really important to remember that the scariest things to write, I think, are the most necessary. To put them down, to put them out there, not even in the name of like catharsis, but just because there's value there. And so I think, if you, when you're writing, ever feel that discomfort come up, I think to find something, some sort of like somatic practice. I've had students who just have like objects on their desk that they can sort of hold. One student of mine had a pine cone that she would hold. I've had another student who had like a stuffed animal that she would put on her lap while writing. And something like that, even though it sounds so weird, but it can be quite useful, just to kind of let yourself know it's okay to go there and like I'm okay writing about it. Okay, was that part one of the question, or did you do the two parts? That was it, okay. I thought, oh my God, what is part two going to be? Yeah, of course.
I have another kind of personal question. It seems like obviously there's a dynamic shift with you and your mom when she starts to go into dementia, and you talk about her as this sort of like hero figure, and then obviously you have to care for her, and it kind of, maybe, I don't know if you would call it switching the parent-child roles,
Totally.
but has that destabilized you, and how did you write through that destabilization, if that happened, just your perception of yourself, or, the way you see the world, just talking about that in particular?
Yeah, well, so, like I talk in the excerpts I read for today, I mentioned my mom as a psychiatrist who saw patients, but the part I didn't share is that she later, after her divorce from my dad, turned to research. So she would do clinical trials. And one of the medications she did clinical trials for is Aricept, which is the leading dementia medication. So when I was caring for her, every morning I had the very strange, surreal experience of placing a pill in her hand that she had helped develop. So it was there were all of these 180 moments of like child to caregiver, doctor to patient, right? I mean, all these reversals. And I think when I started writing this, I didn't know what it was going to be about. Like, I didn't really know that I had misperceived my mother. I didn't know, there were certain things that, like sort of family secrets that came out while I was caring for her, because essentially she forgot to lie to me. And so many people talk about dementia and Alzheimer's in terms of how it robs us of a person, which is of course true. And yet I will say that with my mother, I really feel that I got to know her kind of in like a, the wizard behind the curtain sort of way, that she had fed me all these illusions and myths. And all of that fell away. She no longer had the energy for it, the capacity to maintain it. And so in many ways, I feel like I got access to her. And I think so often with writing, if we go into it knowing, just kind of knowing, that can be not a great thing. But when you find yourself writing and you kind of go, I don't know why I'm writing this. I don't really know what is compelling me or what is drawing me, but there's just stuff here. I mean, for me, like, when you said, how did you write? It's more that I couldn't, like, that was sort of my only way of responding to the situation, was I felt like, God, I'm in this juncture. And my way of responding to that has always been, I need to write about it, because that's the only thing that kind of makes me feel okay and makes life feel manageable, is to just try and write. And then, of course, putting together a book, that's a whole separate process. But I think just at the level of sense making, and let me just try and name this moment or identify what is happening here. Writing is just so, for me, invaluable when it comes to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question about how you structured the book? When, you said you just had to write it, then you have to put craft into practice. And so how did you decide what the structure is going to be? How did you know what the opening chapter was? How did you know where your final passages were going to be?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so a few things, and all of my answers will reveal to you guys just how little I know when I'm going about the writing process. So first, there's something I always think about, which is that I think the first iteration of a piece of writing, you write for you. Then I think there's kind of a middle stage where you start thinking about the story. Like, oh, there's things I need to supply for the story to make sense. Then I think there's a final stage where you anticipate the reader. And that I think of as like an act of hospitality. Like, I built this house for me. I'm then thinking about the dwelling and its kind of architectural needs. And then, oh my God, I'm gonna have a visitor, I'm gonna have a guest. And it's no longer okay for me to be like walking around in my underwear. Like, I need to make things presentable, right? And it's a different, you see it differently. You go, oh my God, are these stairs too steep? How do I get, what's the front door of this house? What's the first thing you see? So I think that lens, that place, you can't get to until you've first written it for you, until you've resided in that space, hung out in it, and then you start anticipating, like, how is the reader going to receive this? And you want to kind of be thoughtful in your hosting. Like, what do I need to give the reader when? So that's just kind of like my general way of thinking about writing. And when I say like 3 versions, first for you, then the thing, and then the reader, that can be, for me, dozens of drafts, like dozens upon dozens. So I'll say that. When I first wrote this book, right now it opens with me in Seattle and I'm pregnant. And I'm starting to realize, like, oh, my mom is kind of not being who I thought she would be. When I first wrote this book, my first draft of it opened the day that I bring her home with me to live in my house. And because for me, the first draft I'm writing for my sake, for me, that's when the story started. Like, oh my God, what am I bringing? I'm taking care of my mom now? This is crazy. And I didn't understand the overall shape of the thing. Once I had the draft and I sat with it, I realized, like, for the reader to appreciate the strangeness of me driving my mom home and now being in charge of her, the reader has to understand a bunch of things. What our dynamic has typically been, the way she's always had the answers, the way she's always been this very matter-of-fact clinical person who has no hesitation or questions or doubts. So, to get back to like the house analogy, this was living in the house, realizing I've put the front door in totally the wrong place and needing to rebuild. And that change of like, oh, I guess I'll start it in Seattle when I'm pregnant, as opposed to, 6 years later, I had to basically scrap the whole manuscript and rewrite it. So it was a lot of work. And then the other thing is, the book is sort of structured around this myth/story that my mother tells me about a woman in a river. The original title for this book was The Woman in the River. And at the time, there were a slew of titles that all followed that recipe of like the feminine person, preposition, place. It was like the girl in the cabin, the woman on the train. And so Penguin Random House at the 11th hour said, no, we have to change the title. So then it became What We Carry. But the prologue opens with the story of the woman in the river, and then I reflect back on it throughout the book. And finally, during my mom's dementia, she tells me an entirely different version of the story. So I already had a book deal. I'd been working with my editor, and that skeleton of the book, like that framework, was not in place. So I would say there were like, dozens of drafts where the woman in the river was not in this. And there was one day when my mom, during her dementia, told me this very different version of the story. And I said, wait, that's not the version you told me when I was pregnant. And we had this funny moment where she said, yeah, I probably didn't want to tell you that version then. So that later version, if you guys read the book, it's in the 3rd section of the book. I wrote that within an hour of it happening. And when it happened, I realized that's going to be the organizing. Like, I'm now going to put the earlier version of that up front, and it's going to be the connective tissue. So that was in place after I had a whole manuscript that I'd sat with for a long time. So I guess this is all to say that sometimes the key structural thing can happen late in time. As illogical and frankly preposterous though that may sound, it's the truth that I think sometimes we write our way into structure rather than structure dictating things. And I think had someone said to me, like had my editor suggested, oh, maybe you could structure this around an Indian myth, the result would have been contrived. So I think sometimes it's like hanging out in a body and then being like, oh, this is where the skeleton should go, okay. Yeah.
Any other questions? Last chance.
Just from start to finish, with the book being on the shelves, how long did this entire process take for you?
Oh, good question. This book was a little different in how it came about. So just the simple answer was I started writing it in 2016, and it came out in 2020. It was different because I've been writing these like social media posts, and the editor who had worked with me on my first novel saw these social media posts and said, oh, I think there's a book here. And she reached out to my agent. So it was different in the sense that I knew, bless you, I knew it was going to be a book early on. My first book, which might be the more useful example, I started writing that in 2009. I finished it pretty soon, but it took me longer to get an agent than to write it. So it took me like 1 year to finish it, 2 years to get an agent. We sent it out. It got rejected by everyone. Every publisher, including like publishers you'd never heard of. It would be like Left Eyebrow Press has said no. And I'd be like, oh my God, really? And, it was like this horrific process that was I was just so demoralized. And my agent said, maybe you could like look through the feedback from these editors because some of them have like taken time to, and I said, okay. So I combed through all their emails. And they had suggested that 2 of the characters should be romantically involved, Stephen and Nora. Many of them suggested this. And I had this really strong, angry feeling of like, no, Stephen and Nora aren't supposed to be together. The whole point is that they have this beautiful platonic friendship where they would never get together. And I thought, oh, the fix that these people have suggested is all wrong. But in a bigger way, they're totally right that I haven't done my job as an author if they think that romance is a possibility between these 2 characters, right? So their remedy for it I was not into, but I realized the fact that that's coming up means that there's an issue here. So I rewrote that book. I kept the first sentence and I kept the last sentence, and I rewrote everything in between. And I thought during that process that I was close to losing it. Like I remember, because I'd already been rejected, right? But the rejection also brought a certain clarity and a certain, oh, this is how I want it to be. And if it gets rejected again, at least I'll know that I wrote it in a way that's true to these characters and how I feel they should be. And that version got multiple offers, and that came out in 2014. So that was 5 years. But it was a long 5 years.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Maya. There's like little snacks next door, so you can ask Maya more questions there. All right. Thanks. Have a great night.